How's it going, everyone? In this video, I'm going to be doing a review of the book Waking Up by Sam Harris. Waking up is best for those with experience in meditation, psychology, consciousness, those types of trains of thoughts, because it assumes sort of a baseline of knowledge and builds upon that. It's also a good fit for those who want to study the mind or deepen their study of the mind, as well as those who are just generally interested in consciousness and spirituality, but not necessarily from a religious point of view. Difficulty to digest. So, Waking Up is actually a pretty difficult book to digest. It assumes a level of baseline knowledge that the reader has that not everyone may have. So, going into this book, it's best if you have some idea of some of the psychological concepts, just, basic psychology, like something you would get out of a bachelor's, as well as some amount of interest or at least experience with meditation. Those two things are going to be pulled on quite a bit. So the more that you've kind of learned about psychology, thought about consciousness, dabbled in meditation, the more you're going to get out of this book. Now, on the bright side, Harris includes a whole bunch of different thought examples and angles to approach these ideas from that help ease the burden a little bit. And there's a bunch of studies that also kind of bolster the claims made in the book. But again, it's a little bit difficult for probably the average or uninitiated reader who doesn't have much context about some of these background topics. So, one of the biggest main themes in Waking Up is this exploration of consciousness. And it's basically looking at consciousness and asking, why do we have consciousness? One of the main driving questions that's really interesting is, how do we create thoughts, right? If you sit there and a thought comes to your mind like, oh, I needed to walk the dog. How exactly is it that we create a thought? And if you think about it, we're not really creating these thoughts. These thoughts are just kind of showing up in consciousness. So that's explored quite a bit here. In addition, there's a bunch of different studies that are shown to kind of give body to how the neuroscience sort of plays out. So, for example, you can split a part of the brain, the corpus callosum, which basically ends up creating two distinct entities that can each see and understand different things, which is really interesting and kind of hard to explain. And then there's a lot of discussion about how there's just a lot going on in the subconscious that we don't necessarily process consciously all the time, which, is partially part of that. Oh, where do thoughts, like, how do these thoughts just show up? Some part of the brain is processing and creating thoughts, and then they show up in consciousness. So Harris doesn't really answer these questions as much as give you a full tour of the sort of questions and the evidence that we do have. But of course, not everything is resolved, because a lot of these questions, like why do we have consciousness, isn't really solved. Harris then moves into some focus on how mindfulness and meditation fit into this framework and how they can be used to kind of look at our thoughts and what's going on in consciousness, as well as their use in being able to increase our well-being. So basically, by being aware of these thoughts and these patterns, we can kind of change how we interact with them. Our general baseline, our normal way of thinking and doing things is kind of on autopilot all the time. So Harris looks at the benefits we can get by slowing down and seeing our thoughts as they are and being able to digest them, and all the benefits that brings, of which there are all kinds of different instances in which it helps to be aware of your thoughts. It helps you slow down emotionally and kind of pick apart things without just reacting. There are also some experiences or exercises or pieces, shared things that you can actually do to meditate. Some of this is going to be good for beginners. Some of this is going to be good for people with a little bit more experience. In general, it's going to be better if you have some experience with meditation, but of course you can kind of take these exercises at face value and participate in them and see where they take you. A relatively large piece of the book conceptually is this idea that sense of self is an illusion, and basically what that means is consciousness can exist separate from a sense of self. Now, this is really hard to understand, and Harris knows that, and he does his best to hit it from a bunch of different angles to try to help you digest what that actually means. It can be really hard to wrap your head around, but all the different angles help increase the chance that it makes some amount of sense. Now, here are a couple of the thought experiments or things that he brings up that help kind of break apart that we don't necessarily need a sense of I to have a state of consciousness, right? Those things feel really tightly linked, but they aren't necessarily. So one of the questions that he brings up, or one of the thought experiments, is basically asking, who is it that we are talking to when we have our internal monologue, right? Why do we need an internal monologue? Because we already know the information. Who are we talking to? What's the communication going between? Who are the entities or parties, right? Why do we need to think something in a dialogue form instead of just act it out? We already should know the information. Another thought experiment he brings up is basically the idea of someone who has complete amnesia, right? So if you have full amnesia, you still have a sense of self, or a set of consciousness at least, but your identity, which is typically formed by your experiences and your personality and all those things in conglomeration, you can't pull any of that information. So, what does that mean in terms of your sense of self? How can you have an I with no associated experiences? Yet, it's really clear that if you had full amnesia, you would still experience some form of consciousness. So, those are just a couple of the different angles. Again, really hard to process. The book does a much better job of kind of flushing out those examples and giving you a full exploration of them. But it still takes some effort. There's another piece that basically says, there's some exercises that you need to do to really understand what's going on, and it's hard to know until you actually do them. So it's worth kind of going through all those steps just to see where you actually end up. There is also a few mentions of psychedelics as a way to open this pathway much faster, kind of by force, instead of just through meditation. It's not a huge focus of the book, but it is mentioned in there. And it is one way that Harris says that you can also break this illusion of the sense of self. So it's not necessarily something he strongly recommends or says like everyone needs to do this, but it's more just another piece of information in there, and it focuses largely on his experience. There is one other section, and it's basically around having spirituality without sticking to religion, and he rags on religion a little bit and pushes back against some of the gurus and other leaders who have abused certain types of power. This is not a primary focus of the book, but it's a strong enough theme that you're definitely going to notice it. So if that's the type of thing that you don't particularly like, just be aware of it. But basically, what he advocates is a spiritual path somewhere between, awe and being open to things, but leaning on what's scientifically available to inform your opinions. So, the overall opinion, I found this book to be really interesting, but I think it's going to be pretty hard to put together if you don't have the right background, right? Just jumping into this without having looked at any of these other concepts, without meditating or having looked at some neurobiology or some psych or something of the sort, it's going to be tough. However, if you have those things and consciousness, especially, is of interest to you, this is going to be a really interesting read with some interesting angles that I haven't really seen anywhere else, or at least they haven't been put together in this way. The other thing is, like I was mentioning, if you don't have strong ties to religion or can read things that go strongly against religion and feel okay about that, then I think this would be a good fit. Other considerations, again, if Harris doesn't think an idea makes sense, he holds no punches against it, right? Some of the stuff can feel very forceful or just very strongly worded. And to some people, that could potentially be off putting. But, as with most resources, just take it with a grain of salt and don't take everything at face value. The other consideration is a lot of these concepts are really hard to digest, especially this illusion of the self. So if you're going to read this book, be prepared to kind of grapple with this idea a little bit and do some exercises. It should be useful regardless, but it's definitely not the easiest thing, even though Harris does his best to guide you through it. All right, on to the applicable content. 1. Thinking without thinking leads us into acting without realizing what we're doing. How can you cultivate more awareness of your thoughts? 2. Exploring consciousness can unlock many interesting insights. Sit in silence with your thoughts for a moment. Where do you think they're coming from? 3. Meditation is touted as one of the best ways to train our minds, but other inlets to mindfulness exist. How often do you intentionally train your brain to be more present and accepting? Hopefully that helps give you an idea of what Sam Harris's Waking Up is all about, and it's basically his exploration of consciousness. There's a lot of interesting points in there. Definitely a worthwhile read if you're interested in consciousness and some of those other related concepts. That's all I've got for this video. So as always, if you have any questions, comments, topics you want me to cover, throw them down in the box below and I'll get to them as soon as I can, and I will see you next time.
You can check out more content at howtohappy.com. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you can stay up to date on the videos. We've also got a Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook that you can check out. Reflect, take action, and enjoy life. See you next time.